On a crisp November evening in 2002, St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, buzzed with the usual weekend energy. Joshua Guimond, a 20-year-old political science major with aspirations of law school and public office, joined friends for a poker game at a student residence. Joshua had been valedictorian and class president at his high school and co-captained the university's mock trial team. He was considered reliable and rarely missed obligations. At about 11:45 p.m., he left the party to use the bathroom, and then, for reasons which are unclear, started toward his dorm. It was a 3-minute walk that crossed a footbridge near Stumpf Lake. Witnesses later recalled seeing him on that bridge after midnight, yet he never arrived home, and he was never seen again. When Joshua failed to return to the card game, his friends just assumed he went home, but when he missed mock trial practice the next day, they realized something was wrong. His car, wallet, and glasses remained in his dorm room, and repeated calls went unanswered. Campus security and the Stearns County Sheriff's Office launched a search. Bloodhounds tracked his scent to the edge of Stumpf Lake, prompting fears that he had fallen into the water on his way back. Divers, boats, and sonar equipment scoured the lake, while volunteers combed nearby woods, but days of searching yielded nothing. National Guard members joined the effort, and his father watched anxiously from the shoreline. The water theory dominated early thinking on this case. The campus sits among several lakes, and 2 other college men in the same region vanished within days of Joshua, and both were later found in local bodies of water. For months, authorities returned to the lake, but no evidence surfaced. Attention turned to Joshua's computer, and it became clear that several days after he vanished, someone entered his dorm and ran a cleaning program on his dorm device. Unfortunately, this would lead to years of setbacks, and this data wouldn't be recovered for nearly half a decade. When investigators eventually recovered data, they discovered he had created multiple profiles on Yahoo Personals. Some accounts portrayed him as a woman and were used to chat with men, often in an explicit manner. This suggested to investigators he might have been exploring his identity and could have arranged a clandestine meeting. Detectives theorized that he may have left the party to meet someone and either willingly or under duress entered a vehicle at the bridge. Notably, while it was determined that cleaning software was used on his computer after his disappearance, it wasn't clear who used it. For reasons which are unclear to me, the initial investigators hadn't sealed his room or taken his computer into storage when he disappeared. I have to assume this was just due to pure ignorance of technology on the part of investigators who may have not fully understood the investigative power of data on a personal computer. A number of theories have been considered in this case, and many still think Joshua might have fallen into water. Bloodhounds led searchers to the lake's edge, and the campus landscape of ponds and wetlands supports the idea of a misstep on a dark path. But repeated dives and sonar sweeps found no remains, and investigators themselves eventually found that this was unlikely, given no evidence was ever found. Notably, Joshua's case is one that's generally brought up in discussions of the smiley face predator hypothesis. However, no hard evidence has ever been established to indicate that he was the victim of a serial perpetrator, and the entire smiley face theory remains unproven regardless. It's been more than 20 years after Joshua Guimond vanished, and his case appears to remain no closer to being resolved today than it was when he went missing. Personally, I think the investigators just completely botched this one when they failed to secure the dorm room and get that computer into an evidence locker as soon as he was reported missing. While some data was recovered, I have to question what wasn't recovered in that process, and what evidence potentially fell by the wayside over time. For instance, he was supposedly talking to all these men under this female assumed identity, but because the authorities didn't secure the evidence fast enough, this created a major issue. If they had Joshua's username in 2003, they could have gotten the records from Yahoo and figured out all the people he communicated with and interviewed them. This ability appears to have been lost due to this massive investigative misstep. A young man vanishes into thin air, his last known location being a storage unit in Lethbridge, Alberta in Canada. Days later, his truck is found torched more than 700 miles away near a remote hiking trail in the mountains of British Columbia. No footprints in the snow, no body, no reliable sightings, just a burned-out vehicle filled with items that shouldn't be there. This is the haunting story of Marshall Iwasa, a 26-year-old whose unexplained disappearance in late 2019 has left investigators and his family searching for answers. After years of hard physical work in construction and landscaping, Marshall enrolled at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in Calgary to study computer programming. He had hoped to build a career that would allow him to earn more money than he was making. However, unknown to his family, he struggled academically, was placed on academic probation, and eventually withdrew from the program, a fact which he appears to have struggled with. On the evening of November 17, 2019, Marshall drove to Lethbridge to visit his mother. She asked him to help with a computer problem and invited him to stay the night. According to later reports, there was nothing unusual about his behavior, and he appeared to be his usual self. He declined the offer to stay because he wanted to pick up belongings from a storage unit he shared with his sister before returning to Calgary. He left his mom's house around 11 and headed toward the storage facility. Security logs and surveillance footage show that Marshall attempted to access the storage locker multiple times overnight. He eventually gained entry shortly after 6 on the 18th of November and spent more than 2 hours inside. At around 8:30, he left the facility, and this is the last confirmed sighting of him. Investigators later determined that no other individuals accessed the unit at the same time, and what he did inside the locker remains unknown. 6 days later, hikers exploring an isolated logging road near Pemberton, British Columbia, spotted a burned-out truck on an unplowed trail. The area is extremely remote, requiring a four-wheel drive vehicle and knowledge of backcountry conditions. It's not on any main route and can't readily be found on any apps or maps. The hikers were unable to call authorities until they reached cell service the following day. On November 25th, the authorities arrived at the scene and confirmed that the vehicle belonged to Marshall. His vehicle was approximately 14 hours from home, and no one was sure how it got there. Around the truck were numerous personal items: clothing, a backpack, a destroyed laptop, and 3 smashed cell phones. Curiously, there were gaming consoles and an expired passport that didn't belong to Marshall. More perplexing, key components such as the steering column and battery were missing. The fire originated inside the passenger cabin of the vehicle, according to the arson investigator hired by the family, leading to suspicions that it had been set deliberately. Investigators themselves haven't publicly released their own arson report, but they have not disputed the conclusion, at least not openly. From the beginning, the Lethbridge Police Service deemed the disappearance suspicious, but maintained that there was no credible or corroborating evidence to suggest foul play. Because the case remained a missing person investigation, rather than a criminal investigation, authorities didn't immediately collect potential evidence such as DNA or fingerprints. They also didn't gather surveillance footage from gas stations along the 700-mile route Marshall would have taken or issue a nationwide alert. This cautious approach frustrated the family, who argued that the burned truck, missing parts, and presence of unusual items should have triggered a criminal investigation. For their part, the authorities seemed to have suspected that he did it himself, hence why they didn't seem to conduct a thorough investigation. They weren't clear as to whether they believed he had ended himself, or if he had voluntarily started a new life, but it was clear they preferred one of these scenarios. And I swear, Canadian cops may give Japanese cops a run for their money when it comes to incompetence. And unlike Japanese cops, Canadian cops have a lot more crime to deal with, so I have no idea what their excuse is. Another theory suggests Marshall may have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements after his truck became stuck. The Pemberton backcountry is unforgiving with steep slopes, dense brush, and rapidly changing weather. An accident, such as falling into a ravine or stream, could conceal a body for years. However, several factors weaken this theory in my view. One investigator determined the truck fire was deliberate, making it unlikely Marshall accidentally set his vehicle ablaze before wandering off. After all, he was deep in the woods, and this would have essentially been the equivalent of burning your ships when you arrive on a new continent, which just sounds implausible. Personally, while I think it's impossible to completely dismiss this theory, I just don't understand why he would have burnt his truck. Many, including his family, believe the evidence points towards foul play. This theory suggests that Marshall was lured by someone after leaving the storage unit, driven to British Columbia by one or more individuals, and ultimately slain. Those who support this theory claim that several details support this view. For instance, the 14-hour journey from Lethbridge to Pemberton would have required at least 2 gas station stops, yet no activity appeared on Marshall's bank account. That said, he may have paid in cash, though his family said this wouldn't have been like him. Also, of course, if he had actually planned this all out, he may have taken along gas canisters with him. These canisters may have eventually been used to light his truck on fire as well, though that's just complete speculation on my part, and no canisters were even recovered. Personally, I think the truck being set on fire is the strongest indication that there may have been foul play at work here. That said, this would have required a tandem driver, since otherwise the perpetrators would have had no meaningful way to escape the deep backwoods area where the truck was found. Despite the suspicious circumstances, no motive or suspects have been identified. There's no evidence linking Marshall to any criminal elements or anyone who might have wanted to harm him. Unfortunately, the disappearance of Marshall Iwasa may never be solved, largely because investigators were slow to consider foul play. Early efforts focused on the possibility of an accident or voluntary disappearance, which delayed crucial forensic work and allowed potential evidence to be lost or contaminated. The burned truck should have triggered an immediate criminal investigation, yet the scene was just treated as puzzling rather than suspicious. By the time authorities acknowledged foul play as plausible, too much time had passed. Personally, I think that if the authorities had gathered surveillance footage from the gas stations along the route in a timely manner, this wouldn't be an unsolved mystery. There's just too much evidence that points to the potential involvement of other parties, and that footage would have potentially cleared up whether he was alone or not while on the road. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. Also, just an extra emphasis on clicking the notification bell, because clicking this is the only way you're assured to see my new videos drop. I've had so many complaints lately from subscribers who say they aren't getting my new videos anymore, and clicking that bell is the only workaround as far as I know. On a mild afternoon in May 2003, families in the town of Kumatori in southern Osaka Prefecture were settling into their routines. The local elementary school had sent its 4th graders on a social studies field trip to the nearby Sewage Science Museum. 9-year-old Yuri Yoshikawa was on her way home. She was dressed in her white short-sleeved school shirt, a dark skirt, bright pink socks patterned with stars, and carrying a Sanrio backpack. She had left the sewage museum with 3 friends around 2:40 p.m. The girls walked together until they reached a traffic light on Nanayama Street, about 1 mile from Yuri's house, where they waved goodbye. A boy pedaling past on his bicycle saw Yuri alone a few minutes later on a quiet hillside road. He was sure it was Yuri because he lived in the same neighborhood, and while he wasn't one of her friends, he knew her fairly well. He exchanged a casual greeting and rode off, and with that, no one has seen Yuri since. When Yuri hadn't returned by 5 p.m., her older brother alerted their parents. The family canvassed the neighborhood, but by 7:30 they had to call police. Investigators initially treated the case as a kidnapping for profit and waited with the family for a ransom demand that never came. After the first crucial hours passed with no word, the Osaka Prefectural Police mobilized hundreds of officers and volunteers. Notably, this initial wait period has been highly controversial. According to the cops, they were worried that visible police activity could endanger Yuri if the kidnapper was holding her for ransom. Under this theory, Yuri may have been eliminated if the kidnapper thought the heat on him was getting too intense. That said, it's unclear why they believed this theory at all, and the only thing to support it is perhaps the fact that her father was a wealthy businessman. Witnesses reported hearing no screams or signs of a struggle, fueling speculation that Yuri may have been lured rather than snatched by force. In 2003, the area had few security cameras, and cars with dashboard cameras were extremely rare, so investigators had to rely on human memory. The investigation quickly went cold and fully stalled out until a decade later. In 2013, a woman came forward with a startling memory. On the day Yuri disappeared, she had been driving near the hillside road when she noticed a white car parked awkwardly at the roadside. As she slowed to pass, she glanced into the vehicle and saw a middle-aged man at the wheel and a young girl in the passenger seat wearing a white shirt. Over the years, 2 more people reported seeing a similar car that afternoon. Police eventually announced that the vehicle was likely a Toyota Crown from the late 1980s and that they had quietly been investigating this model for years. The cops had known about this vehicle the entire time and hadn't released this information to the public. Investigators traced about 900 such cars registered in southern Osaka and interviewed almost all of them, yet none of the inquiries led to a breakthrough. The delay in releasing this clue provoked a ton of criticism because the police kept the sighting secret for 10 years. Even today, the police have not released the composite sketch drawn from witness descriptions, fearing that an inaccurate image could misdirect the public, again drawing criticism. Yuri's parents, Nagaki and Haruko Yoshikawa, have fought for their daughter's return in a way that attracted the wrong sort of attention from scammers. Nagaki Yoshikawa was an extremely successful businessman, and this fact didn't go unnoticed. The family's ordeal deepened in 2004 when a man and woman approached Nagaki claiming to be psychics who knew Yuri's whereabouts. They not only claimed that they had seen visions of her, but that she was alive and could rescue her. And to do this, they claimed they needed big heaping piles of cash to fuel all their needs while they focused on their quote-unquote psychic work. Over the next 4 years, they convinced the parents to transfer a total of roughly 70 million yen in exchange for vague updates about their daughter. To put this in context, adjusted for inflation, this is over $1 million. The psychics told the parents that the police didn't approve of their methods, and if they told them about it, they couldn't help them anymore. Believing they could be jeopardizing Yuri's safety, they didn't inform police of the psychic involvement. Eventually, the pair's demands drained the family's savings, and when they couldn't pay up anymore, the psychics said they had to stop working with the family. Only then did the parents confide in investigators what had happened, and they arrested the con artists in 2008 on fraud charges. There are a number of theories about what may have happened to Yuri, and the most straightforward one is that Yuri was abducted by a stranger. Early on, investigators considered that someone might have targeted the family for ransom, likely due to the wealth of the family. However, no ransom demand arrived, and the subsequent appearance of a suspicious white car with a middle-aged male driver suggests an opportunistic abduction. Another hypothesis is that Yuri was accidentally struck by a vehicle on the narrow hillside road. In this scenario, a driver panicked and hid her body rather than reporting the collision. Supporters of this idea point to the steep, winding roads around Nanayama and the absence of screams or evidence of a struggle. A rapid collision could have knocked Yuri unconscious, and she could have later perished. Investigators did consider a hit and run, though they were unable to find any evidence that it actually occurred. Perhaps the most bizarre possibility of all is that North Korean agents were involved in her abduction, and that she perhaps may still be alive. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, North Korea abducted several Japanese citizens. Some of those who were kidnapped were children, and they were brought to North Korea to train North Korean infiltrators to speak Japanese at a native level. These infiltrators were raised entirely in a Japanese cultural context, so that when they were eventually deployed to Japan, they would completely blend in. Under this theory, it's been speculated that Yuri was taken to be a friend for a North Korean child, raised for this future role. However, it's been noted that by 2003, the program of abducting Japanese citizens had officially wrapped up, but of course, with North Korea, who really knows? The disappearance of Yuri Yoshikawa remains one of Japan's most haunting mysteries. More than 20 years on, the case is still open, and the Yoshikawa family continues to wait, hoping against all reason that their daughter may one day return to them. On the night of March 19, 1919, the city of New Orleans was alive with the sounds of music. It was St. Joseph's Day, a holiday of deep significance to the city's large Italian population, but the music that filled the humid air wasn't one of quiet reverence. From the grandest dance halls to the most humble houses, the raw, improvisational energy of jazz spilled out into the streets to ward off what they believed to be an otherworldly threat. Professional bands played to packed rooms, while families with amateur musicians gathered in their parlors, their instruments a shield against the darkness. This citywide concert was an act of collective exorcism. Just days earlier, the Times-Picayune newspaper had published a letter from a man who claimed to be the serial predator stalking their neighborhoods. He called himself the Axeman, and let the readers know that he was a demon from the hottest pits of hell. This man, in the guise of a demonic entity, issued a bizarre ultimatum. At 15 minutes past midnight, he would once again pass through the city, but he would spare all those inside any home where a jazz band was in full swing. This surreal night, where a city's greatest cultural export became a talisman against its deepest fear, is the perfect entry point into the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans of 1918 was a city on the edge, filled with various tensions. It was a major port still buzzing from its role in the global conflict that had engulfed the world, but also a place worn down by economic uncertainty and a far more prolific threat. Long before the first Axeman attack, a deadlier, invisible enemy had already laid siege to the city. The Spanish flu arrived in the fall of 1918, brought in on the very ships that were the city's lifeblood. The public health response was slow and ultimately ineffective, striking down the young and healthy with terrifying speed. This event created the ideal psychological conditions for a new kind of terror to take hold. The city was already traumatized by this virus that entered homes unannounced, leaving devastation in its wake. Further, Public trust in authority had been eroded by what many saw as the failure of officials to contain this unseen entity. When the Axeman began his attacks, it felt like a second wave of a familiar nightmare. He too was an invisible threat who violated the sanctity of the home, and his own letter to the press even claimed he was an invisible stalker who struck in the night. Yet, amidst this atmosphere of extreme anxiety, New Orleans was also giving birth to something vibrant and new. In the late 19th century, a new kind of music was forming, and it was the perfect fusion of the African, European, and Caribbean traditions that permeated the city. This music, which we would come to know as jazz, would be the only thing that could soothe the soul of this beastly predator. And it's very important to keep this connection to jazz in mind, because the most compelling theory of who this unseen predator was turns pretty heavily on this form of music. The Axeman's story is inextricably linked to the story of Sicilian immigrants in New Orleans. Beginning in the late 19th century, a massive wave of Sicilians arrived in the city, fleeing poverty in their homeland for the promise of work on Louisiana's sugar and cotton plantations. New Orleans became a primary port of entry, and by the time of the Axeman attacks, its Italian-American population was second only to New York City. These immigrants established a vibrant community in the lower French Quarter, an area that soon became known as Little Palermo. Crucially, many did not remain laborers for long. Through incredible hardship and thrift, they followed a common trajectory from the plantation fields to entrepreneurship. They opened small businesses, most notably corner grocery stores. By 1920, Italian-owned businesses accounted for half of all grocery stores in the city, and they were a visible and vital part of every neighborhood. This rapid economic success, however, came at a price, and some theorize that individuals like the Axeman would target this group for attacks due to this success. The Axeman's spree began on May 23, 1918, and immediately established a chillingly consistent pattern. The perp would gain entry to his victims' homes, which were often connected to their grocery stores, by chiseling out a panel on a back door. He would then select a weapon from the premises, usually an axe, and attack his victims as they slept. Robbery was never the motive, and money and valuables were consistently left untouched. The first victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, who were found brutally eliminated in their apartment. Joseph's throat had been cut with a straight razor before both he and his wife were bludgeoned with an axe. Over the next year and a half, the attacks continued, each one adding to the city's growing panic. The terror reached a new peak in March 1919, when the perpetrator crossed the Mississippi River to the suburb of Gretna and attacked the Cortimiglia family. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia were gravely injured, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, was slain. The final string of attacks occurred between August and October 1919, ending with the brutal and fatal attack on a grocer named Mike Pepitone. And keep this victim in mind, because he's going to come up again shortly. And then, as mysteriously as it began, the reign of terror stopped, the Axeman having claimed as many as 17 victims in just under 2 years. The police investigation was, from the beginning, a catalog of failures that reflected the city's deepest social fractures. The New Orleans Police Department of the era was notoriously corrupt and lacked any modern investigative techniques whatsoever. Forensic science was in its infancy, and crime scenes were often poorly managed. In the Maggio case, for instance, the weapon was found on a neighbor's lawn only after an incomplete initial search of the home. The concept of a serial predator was also largely foreign to the police of New Orleans. Most investigators simply couldn't accept that one man could be behind these attacks, potentially with no motivation beyond the thrill of taking another life. However, interestingly, one investigator did go on the record saying that he believed that the Axeman was one single figure with a Jekyll and Hyde personality. Other potential motivations, such as prejudice towards the city's Italian community, were also ignored. The cops primarily focused on the potential that the attacks were a vendetta within the Italian community. Italians coming to America and bringing along vendettas from the old country was a popular narrative in the media at the time, and the investigators bought into it fully. Ultimately, against this backdrop, it's perhaps completely unsurprising that the phantom attacker was never caught. Over the century since the attacks, three main theories about the Axeman's identity have persisted. The most popular theory at the time was that the attacks were mafia-related, either vendettas or Black Hand extortion attempts gone wrong. And just by way of background, the Black Hand were extortion groups from Italy who targeted Italian and Italian-American communities. However, unlike the mafia, they were only very loosely organized in any meaningful sense. However, experts then and now have largely discounted this. The mafia used guns, not axes, and they didn't leave survivors, as the Axeman frequently did. That said, these Black Hand groups are potentially a more likely culprit, since unlike the mob, anyone could claim to be part of the Black Hand. It was simply a label some criminals used to make themselves much more intimidating to their potential victims of extortion. The second theory is that the Axeman was a lone, psychologically disturbed individual. He may have been motivated by his extreme Italophobia, or he may have seen them as a marginalized community that could be more easily targeted. Another variant of this theory draws on the evidence of the letter and suggests that the Axeman may have been conducting sacrifices or occult rituals. However, the records from the crime scenes don't appear to show any direct evidence of occult involvement. Further yet, it's not even clear that the letter itself was sent by the Axeman himself. The third theory centers on a single compelling suspect, Joseph Mumfre. Mumfre was a known criminal who ran a blackmailing gang that targeted Italian business owners. The most damning evidence against him emerged years after the attacks had stopped. In 1921, the widow of the Axeman's final victim, Mike Pepitone, was living in Los Angeles. Mumfre tracked her down and allegedly threatened to, quote, do what he did to her husband if she didn't pay him. She didn't feel like paying up, and happened to be armed at the time, so she started blasting. She later told police that she recognized Mumfre as a man she had seen lurking near her home on the night of her husband's slaying. Notably, Mumfre was also something of an entrepreneur and happened to be the quote-unquote manager of a number of local jazz bands. The letter to the newspaper forced households and establishments to book jazz bands, and sales of jazz sheet music went through the roof. Mumfre, in essence, may have turned the art form of jazz itself into a disturbing element of a protection racket. While the evidence is entirely circumstantial and his guilt is still debated, the case for Joseph Mumfre as the Axeman is ultimately quite strong. There are, of course, others who have speculated that there never really was a New Orleans Axeman, and that the entity itself was a creation of the media. However, what historians have agreed is most likely is that the media attempted to tie in additional victims of crime to sell more papers. After all, reporting on an Axeman attack was more likely to move a paper than a regular run-of-the-mill attack, so the financial incentive and motivation was there. Whatever the case, the Axeman was never caught, and his identity was never confirmed, leaving behind yet another occult scar on the disturbing and dark history of New Orleans. On a humid July day in 1998, the peace of Strasburg, Virginia was shattered by a crime that would haunt the Shenandoah Valley for decades. A young mother was stabbed in her apartment, and her 10-week-old daughter vanished without a trace. In 2025, the alleged perpetrator, Daniel Pompel, would be arrested. But despite this arrest, one massive question remains outstanding. On July 27, 1998, 20-year-old Silena Jo Dalton failed to show up for her shift at a local fast food restaurant. Worried, one of her co-workers went to her second-floor apartment on South Charles Street in Strasburg. The friend knew something was wrong when she saw Dalton's black convertible parked outside with the top down. Inside, she discovered Dalton's body on the living room couch. She had been stabbed repeatedly while sleeping and appeared to have been deceased for hours. Dalton's 10-week-old daughter, Allison, was nowhere to be found, and several baby bottles were missing. Investigators arrived quickly, launching a search for the infant and collecting evidence in what was now both a slaying and a suspected abduction. The medical examiner determined that Silena had been stabbed 5 times. Based on the condition of the body, investigators estimated that she had perished between 9:15 and 10:30 that morning, a relatively narrow window for the crime to have occurred. Neighbors later told police they had not heard screams, but one person reported seeing a man placing a baby into the passenger side of a truck around 9 o'clock. Another witness recalled hearing a disturbance that morning and seeing a man leaving the apartment with a bundle under his arm. This witness wasn't quite sure what the bundle was and couldn't say if it was a baby or just a jacket. At the time of her death, Silena Dalton was in the process of getting paternal DNA tests to establish her boyfriend, Daniel Pompel, as Allison's father. She was also pursuing child support payments against him. Pompel acknowledged visiting Silena that morning, and he claimed he knocked on the door and left when no one answered. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the attack or the disappearance. Early searches of his home yielded no evidence, and sources report that he was cooperative at the time. Silena's mother, who suddenly found herself raising her daughter's other child and caring for Silena's memory, was not content to sit idly by. In 2000, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Pompel seeking $1.5 million in damages. The purpose wasn't the money, but rather, she hoped the civil action would unearth new information or force Pompel to answer questions publicly. However, without hard evidence linking him to the crime, the suit was dismissed for lack of proof before it even got to the discovery stage where he could be questioned. Family and friends remained convinced of Pompel's involvement, but there was little more they could do. In the years that followed, the Dalton case faded from the headlines and the case went cold. In 2017, investigators expressed hope that modern DNA techniques would uncover new leads. However, the technology just wasn't there at that point. Investigators carefully preserved evidence from the crime scene, including a red mechanic's rag found near Silena's body. At the time, they believed the rag may have been used to muffle her screams. In 2025, as part of a renewed cold case initiative supported by the Virginia Attorney General's Office and federal grants, police obtained a search warrant for Pompel's DNA. Pompel had refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample when investigators approached him a few years earlier. After executing the warrant, forensic analysts compared his DNA with the biological material found on the rag. Court documents allege that the rag contained both Silena's DNA and Pompel's DNA, supporting the theory that it was used during the commission of the crime. On September 27, 2025, the Virginia State Police announced the arrest of 56-year-old Daniel Pompel on a charge of first-degree slaying. He was taken into custody in Culpeper County, where he lived. According to court documents, the arrest was based primarily on the DNA link between Pompel and the red rag. Court documents suggest the rag was identical to Red Mechanic's rags found in Pompel's home, and that his biological evidence was all over the rag. Notably, despite his apparent cooperation in the investigation back in the 90s, the authorities have gone on the record saying that he never asked about his missing daughter. Many have interpreted this as cause for significant concern about her whereabouts, but for reasons that I'm about to get into, I think there's a glimmer of hope here. While the arrest marked a major development, many questions remain. Most importantly, Allison Dalton has not been found, and if she is still alive, she would be 27 years old today. Age progression images released in 2017 show a young woman with brown hair and eyes, reflecting the baby's features. Investigators continue to work under the assumption that the person who ended the life of her mom also abducted Allison. Since Pompel's arrest is for the slaying only, the abduction remains an open case. Genetic genealogy has the potential to be the tool that finally sheds light on what happened to Allison. While traditional DNA comparisons rely on direct matches to known individuals, genetic genealogy takes the process a step further by building family trees from partial genetic links. If investigators can recover a viable DNA sample from any item connected to Allison, it could be cross-referenced against vast genealogical databases. In this case, if Allison survived, it's almost certain that she was abandoned somewhere where she could be found and be subsequently adopted. Adoption complicates genetic genealogy because it often severs the paper trail between biological and legal families. Records may be sealed, altered, or inaccessible, making it harder to connect DNA matches to the correct lineage. As such, this approach would likely require her own DNA to be present in a database, since nobody who matches to her will know who she is. One reason I speculate that Allison could still be alive is the lack of any remains ever being found, despite extensive searches. Infants can be hidden or relocated much more easily than older children. If she was taken by someone, like for instance her father potentially, she may have been subsequently passed off and grown up without ever realizing her true origins. There have been numerous cases where stolen infants survive into adulthood under assumed identities, living what appear to be ordinary lives. For instance, there's a practice going back to the Middle Ages known as a baby box, where churches will offer a place to leave a baby anonymously. This is generally believed to be to keep the babies from being abandoned and succumbing to exposure. But first, let's discuss the motive for a second, because I also think this bolsters the possibility that Allison is alive. Police have suggested that financial pressure may have played a role as Silena sought child support, and Pompel expressed frustration at the prospect of paying. It's also possible that the attack stemmed from a confrontation over the paternity test. If Pompel did it, by abandoning Allison somewhere safe, he wouldn't have had to pay the support he so despised. Further yet, whoever took the baby also took baby bottles along with him, which indicates that the person in question intended to keep the infant alive. Notably, he could have sold the baby through a black market baby ring as well. At present, Pompel continues to maintain his innocence and await trial. If Pompel did it, and if Allison is still alive, it would appear that he has substantial leverage to cut a deal to solve her case as well.